has science buried faith in God, that idea? And this is near and dear to my heart because I was a science student and I was struggling with this question. I had a lot of atheist friends, atheist professors. Sometimes I felt like I was the only Christian at university. And so it was questions like these. Has science made miracles impossible? Is there any scientific proof for God? Is faith just a blind leap in the dark? Are faith and science compatible? Can a Christian be a scientist? These kinds of questions that I was asking myself, and the reality is when I travel around, and I go all over the place, I was in California just last weekend, the number one question I get, and this isn't the only issue I speak on, has to do with science. There's a lot of our kids out there who are struggling to be scientifically minded, but also maintain their Christian faith. I call these gospicles. Anyone heard of the word gospical? Probably not, because I made it up. What do you think the word means? Gospical. It's an obstacle of the... There you go. You guys are out there. So gospel is an obstacle of the gospel, and there are lots of gospicles out there. Hell is a gospel for a lot of students. You go to a university campus, you'll hear someone say, I can't believe in a God who would send anybody to hell. You'll hear homosexuality has become this line in the sand that you must, have a certain view towards homosexual behavior or same-sex marriage. It's become a gospel. I can't believe in a God who, wouldn't accept this type of behavior. But science has become a gospel for a lot of students. And so this is what we're going to look at. We're going to look at both science and the definition of faith. Now, there was an article, you shouldn't see the text there very well, but there was an article just the other day. I don't have the dates on there. But this guy, Lawrence Krauss, he's an atheist. He's writing in the New Yorker. Look at the title of this article. This is going to be read by thousands of people, maybe more. The title is, All Scientists Should Be Militant Atheists. This is the kind of thing that our students are hearing on a daily basis, in particular if they're in a scientific environment. And so what it says here is, I highlighted, this commitment to open questioning is deeply tied to the fact that science is an atheistic enterprise. It's ironic, really, that so many people are fixated on the relationship between science and religion. Basically, there isn't one. There is no relationship. And I'm going to spend the next 3 hours, or however long we have together, showing you that is so false. That is so false. So here we go. Let's start by looking at the word faith to see if it's compatible with science. So over time, words have a tendency of changing their meanings, okay? Some words have actually come to mean the exact opposite of what they used to mean. So consider the word awful. A century ago, it literally meant to be full of awe, okay? And so testifying to an awful sunset would have been communicating reverence for such an event. However, today, the word awful is almost exclusively used to articulate something as extremely displeasant or distasteful, okay? Ironically, the term has come to mean the exact opposite of what it used to mean. So if I go home to my wife and girls and I say, honey, you look awful today, she's going to slap me probably. She's going to say, excuse me. And I'll say, no, 1915 awful, not 2015 awful. No, because awful has changed meanings, right? In the same way, the word faith has actually changed its meaning. Think of Mark Twain here, famously coined a number of phrases that we use. And here's one. He says, faith is believing what you know ain't true. Faith is believing what you know ain't true. Richard Dawkins, probably the most famous atheist alive today. Here's how he defines faith. Faith is persistent false belief. Persistent false belief. Held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. So here's all the evidence on one side, and faith is basically going the other way. So think of it like this. On one end of the spectrum, you have faith, right? Or science on this side. On the other end, you have faith. If you have no evidence, well, that's when you need a lot of faith. We might even call that wishful thinking, right? On the other end, you have science, and this is where you actually know stuff. You have lots of evidence. So you can see on this view, these are completely at odds with each other. Science and faith are not compatible here. But is that what faith really means? Well, John Lennox, I mentioned him earlier. This guy's known for having more letters after his name than actually in his name, okay? So he's one of these really smart guys, and he writes this. He says, faith is a response to the evidence, not rejoicing in the absence of it. It's a response to the evidence. Who are we going to believe? Richard Dawkins or John Lennox? Well, here's how I describe faith to people. I wish we had time to go into the Bible and show you all the texts, and there's many texts that I could illustrate this point, but we'll just, for sake of time, I'll just give you this illustration. So faith, I believe, is active trust based on evidence. Consider this. You're standing at the edge of Niagara Falls. Anyone been to Niagara Falls? It's a good time. So years ago, in fact, just a couple years ago, they had a guy on a tightrope walk across. I don't know if you guys remember that. Well, even many more years ago, they had a guy do it. He had no safety harness. In fact, he was hired. His name was Charlie Blondin. He was hired by the Falls to actually walk across. And he was just entertainment, and he did a lot of different cool stunts. One, he came across, stopped in the middle, lowered a bottle down, picked up some water, took a drink, and then kept going. Well, there was one instance where he actually had a wheelbarrow full of rocks, okay? And he was walking across the falls. Now imagine you're standing there, and you're watching him do it. He does it once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. Like, it's incredible. You're mesmerized. And he sees you watching. And so he comes over to you, and he says, do you have faith that I could do it again? Do you have faith that I could do it again? And you say, well, yeah, I've seen you do it about 10 times in a row. Sure, I got faith you could do it again. And then he takes those rocks, he dumps them out, and he says, okay, hop in. Right? That's biblical faith. Why is that biblical faith? Because biblical faith has 3 components. 3 components. And if you miss any one of these, you're not talking about biblical faith anymore. The first thing is biblical faith has an object of your faith. When someone says, I'm a person of faith, I have no idea what they're talking about if there's no object, if they don't have faith in something like Jesus. Some of you here, you watch Oprah or something. Oh yeah, I'm just a person of faith. But there's no object there. The other thing is there's content, there's a belief. So there's the belief in Jesus Christ as your Savior. And then finally, there's a commitment, the act of trust. I like to illustrate it this way. So I'm going to hop on a plane on Tuesday. I'm going to go to Atlanta, okay? Now, the object of my faith is the airplane and the pilot. The content is the belief it's going to take me to Atlanta. And finally, the commitment. I haven't put my faith in that thing, biblically speaking. I haven't put my trust in that thing until I step onto the aircraft. That's putting my faith in it, okay? And it's the same way with our faith in Jesus. And so here we have this idea of faith is not contrary to science. In fact, the belief that it gets me there to Atlanta, the fact that the guy walked across the tightrope 10 times, there was evidence there. There was trust. In fact, I tell people, I have more faith in my wife today than I did when I married her 7 years ago. And why do I have more faith in her? Why do I trust her even more 7 years later? Well, because she's given me 7 years worth of examples, of reasons, of evidence to trust her more and more, okay? And so you should have more faith in God today than you did when you first became a Christian. Why? Because God is faithful, and because he's shown himself over and over to you, because he's given you more and more reasons to trust him, okay? So trust and evidence, they're not at odds. Faith and evidence and science are not at odds. But what is science? Let's look at science for a second. Let's actually look where it originated. At the foundation of science lies the conviction that the universe is orderly. Without this belief, science would have actually been impossible. Many historians of science have actually asked the question, why did science start in the West and nowhere else? Why was science stillborn in China and Africa but blossomed in the West? Well, here's what a Nobel Prize-winning biochemist said. He said, as I try to discern the origin of that conviction, he says, I seem to find it in the basic notion discovered 2,000 or 3,000 years ago and enunciated first to the Western world by the ancient Hebrews, namely that the universe is governed by a single God and not the product of the whims of many gods, each governing his own province according to its own laws. This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation of modern science. What Calvin is saying is that monotheism was the fertile soil in which modern science was able to plant its roots and grow. So belief in God, you'll often hear, if you get into these kinds of discussions, they'll say, God, he's a science stopper. Oh, you believe in God? You can't let him in the laboratory. God's a science stopper. What I tell people is, no, you don't understand. God is the modern science starter, okay? The reason we have modern science is because of men's belief in God. In fact, here's what C.S. Lewis said. C.S. Lewis said this: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver or a legislator, okay? That's why. Who are these men he's speaking of? I don't know, maybe you've heard of some of these guys. Francis Bacon, considered the father of modern science. Galileo, Kepler, Pascal, Boyle, Newton, Faraday, Mendel, Pasteur, Kelvin, James Clerk Maxwell. I mean, these guys are the guys you read about if you open a science textbook. I went to a public school system. No one told me these guys were theists and many Christians. You just didn't hear about that. In fact, if you go to the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University, James Clerk Maxwell, he had a Latin inscription carved onto the door. I don't know, can anyone read Latin here? I'll read it to you in English, and maybe you'll recognize this phrase. It says this: "Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in him." That's Psalm 111:2. This is on the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge University. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Maxwell saw no incompatibility between science and his faith. In fact, for him, God wasn't a hindrance to science. It was his inspiration for science. It was his inspiration. Now, science is it's notoriously hard to define. Philosophers debate, what do we mean by science? Let me tell you two ways that science is being used in our culture. The word science is being used as a methodology and a philosophy. You guys have probably all heard of the scientific method, right? Science class, we learn about the scientific method. You know, you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you come to the conclusion, right? Well, there's also the term science is being used kind of philosophically as well. And by philosophically, I mean only certain conclusions are permitted. Only certain conclusions are permitted. Basically, naturalism is all that's allowed. Only natural explanations or causes. You guys remember the show Cosmos, Carl Sagan? Nature is all there is, all there was, and all there ever will be. This is naturalism. And so, let me give you an illustration to kind of flesh this out a little bit. The difference between the methodology and the philosophy can be summarized this way. Imagine someone's killed here. Imagine my friend Justin is killed in this church, okay? And the chief of police show up, the forensic detectives, and because he's such an important guy, the chief says, this case is your top priority. I want you to use your best forensic methodology to find the killer. And then the forensic detectives are like, okay, let's go to do this. Let's do our CSI thing. And then he says, oh, wait, 1 minute. You can't implicate a white man. You can't convict. You can't charge a white man. Now, immediately our first question should be, okay, but what if a white man did it, right? You see, that conclusion is being excluded before we even look at the evidence. The same thing has happened in science. Before you look at the cell, before you look at the universe, before you look at anything, you can only come to naturalistic explanations. No supernatural allowed. And just to prove this point to you, let me show you what a famous geneticist at Harvard University, this is what he says. His name's Richard Lewontin. Try and follow this quote. It's a little bit long, but I think it's very telling about what's going on in universities like Queen's. It says, Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. He says this, we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. This is naturalism. It says this, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori, that's before the evidence, adherence to material causes, to create an apparatus of investigation, a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Now listen to this. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. What he's saying is, it doesn't matter if all the evidence points to intelligent design and to a creator and to creation. That is excluded from science because it's not supernatural. It's not natural. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. And that's why when someone says to you, creationism, that's not science, intelligent design, that's not science, they're not talking about the methodology. These guys follow the same scientific method, but they're talking about the philosophy. They're excluding a possible explanation. Most of the time, scientists come to a naturalistic explanation, but not every time. Not every time. And so many people have come to the belief that, listen, over time, all those things we thought were supernatural explanations, they're decreasing. You know, years ago, they used to think lightning came from the lightning god and thunder came from the thunder god. But now we know lightning is an electrical discharge. Thunder is just rapidly heated, rapidly expanding air molecules. See? We're going to explain everything naturally. And so they come up with this idea. It's called the God of the gaps. Basically, we have all these gaps in our knowledge. That's what they think. We have all these gaps in our knowledge. Like, man, that cell is just really complicated. We just can't explain it. And so let's just say God did it. That's what they think our argument is. It's just we're ignorant about something, so let's say God did it. Lightning? Oh man, couldn't figure that one out. Let's say God did it. But science is closing the gaps. And what they think is eventually everything will be explained naturally. Everything. And so what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is we don't believe in a God of the gaps. We don't believe in a God of the gaps. We believe in a God because there's powerful positive evidence. It's not an argument from ignorance. It's not what we don't know. It's what we do know. Let me show you what we do know. And this is just going to get us started in some of the evidence that we're going to look at over the next little while. It's from the origin of the universe. Okay, and this is where it gets fun for me because I am a physics teacher, and we're going to talk a little bit about physics and astronomy. So the first evidence is the origin of the universe. Now, a few centuries ago, for many centuries, atheists have always affirmed that the universe is eternal, okay? The universe is eternal and uncaused. Christians, on the other hand, have always affirmed the first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created. So there was a beginning to the universe. It was created. Now, up until the 20th century, there was no way to scientifically determine who was right. There was some philosophical arguments, but no scientific argument to say who was right, whether the universe had a beginning or not. This all changed, though, in the early part of the 20th century with a man named Albert Einstein. You guys recognize him? Most people know who that guy is just from the face. He's a German theoretical physicist. He developed mathematical equations for his theory of general relativity, okay? And so this was back in 1917. These equations pointed strongly to the fact that the universe was expanding, okay? Or contracting, actually. The equation you're looking at the screen actually was the equation he was dealing with. Now, here's the problem. Einstein knew, that if the universe was expanding, if you go back in time, it must have had a beginning. And a beginning implies a beginner. And Einstein didn't want that. Despite what you've heard, maybe in emails or whatever, Einstein that we know of was not a theist, okay? Was not a Christian, was not a theist. He didn't like this idea. So what he did was he added what they call the cosmological constant, or a fudge factor. And that kept the universe from expanding. I mean, it didn't literally keep it from expanding. It showed that his equation, though, the universe was static. Oh, it's eternal again. This is great. The problem is, the evidence from the universe was going to start shouting back at Einstein. In fact, he would come to believe that that was the biggest blunder of his life. Those are his words. The cosmological constant was the biggest blunder of his life. And the reason he came to that conclusion was because Einstein had a friend named Edwin Hubble. And in 1929, he went to visit his friend Edwin Hubble at the Mount Wilson Observatory. He looked through a 100-inch telescope, and he saw indeed that the universe was expanding. Well, what did he see? Let me show you what he saw. But I have to give you a little bit of a physics lesson, okay? So you may know or you may not know that the white light inside this room actually contains all the color spectrum of light, all the way from red to violet, okay? And so there's different colors of light have different what we call wavelengths, okay? And as you can see on the screen, the longer wavelengths are red, and the shorter wavelengths are violet or blue near the end, okay, of this color spectrum. Now, here's what he saw. When he looked out in through his telescope, he saw that the galaxies he was looking at and the stars he was looking at in those galaxies were actually red shifted. What does that mean? Well, you guys know there's something called the Doppler effect. If you've ever seen a race car go by, you've ever been to a track, it goes, you know what I'm talking about? I can do this all day. What's happening is the sound waves are being compressed as it comes towards you. And it creates a high frequency. And then as soon as it passes you, the frequency drops, okay? Low frequency, because the waves now are being stretched out. Okay? So compressed, stretched. Now here's the issue. Here's the issue. The same phenomenon happens with light. And when light, it turns out, if these are moving away from us, it explains why the galaxies and stars are red shifted. If they're moving away, the wavelengths are being stretched. If they're moving closer to us, it would be blue shifted, compressed. And what we see is when we look out in our space telescope, back in 1929, when they looked out and they saw these galaxies, they actually saw that they were indeed redshifted and being expanded out, stretched out. Now here's what Einstein knew and what we've come to believe, and that is, if you go back in time, if you just go back and play this thing backwards, yesterday the universe was smaller, and the day before it was smaller. And if you just keep going, okay, what you end up with is you come to a point where there's just nothing. There is absolutely no physical space. There's no matter. There's no energy. In fact, this is a beginning point to time itself. What happened before time? Well, even to ask that question is kind of mind-numbing. And so this pointed us, this red shift pointed us to a beginning to the universe. This is one of the evidences that indeed our universe has a beginning, okay? Indeed it has a beginning. Let me show you one more, that it has a beginning. And it has to do with the second law of thermodynamics. Now, the first law of thermodynamics basically says that energy is not created or destroyed, okay? But the second law says that it's called the law of entropy. Basically, all the usable energy in the universe is running down, okay? Energy is, overall remains constant, but the usable energy is running out. You can think of it kind of like a car running out of gas, okay? Over time, the car runs out of gas. Our universe is no different, okay? Our universe is running out of gas as well. Now, how does this show that the universe had a beginning? Well, think about it this way. A car is a little different than the universe. A car is an open system. That is, if it runs out of gas, what can you do? Well, you just go to the gas station and fill it up, right? And so here we have our car filled up again. The universe isn't like that. When the universe runs out of gas, we're in trouble. In fact, physicists call this the heat death of the universe. All molecular motion will essentially cease, okay? And so you don't have to worry about this. I mean, it's going to be trillions of years from now. But the fact is, the universe is running out of energy. Now, think about this. Think about this. Let's say we go into our parking lot, and we find a car running. We just see a car out there, and it's on, the keys are in it, it's running. You would know for certain that that car had not been running for an eternity. You're thinking, of course, yeah, cars were only invented so long ago. No, forget about that. You would know that car hadn't been running from eternity, because if it had been running from eternity, it would have run out of gas by now. In fact, and this is a head scratcher, it would have actually run out of gas an eternity ago if it had been running for eternity. And so the fact that our universe has gas in the tank, the fact that there is still usable energy in our universe, shows that it had begun at some point. It had a beginning. Now here's the question. What, of all the possible explanations, what could possibly explain the creation of matter? Well, maybe something immaterial. Remember, all material comes into existence at a point. The cause must be immaterial. All of space comes into existence at a point in time. Well, it must be spaceless, the cause. It created time itself. Can you see that this is probably a timeless cause? You could argue changeless. You could argue extremely powerful to create a universe. And you could even argue that it's personal, because the effect and the cause are not simultaneous. The effect actually, which we would call God, the cause we call God, produced the effect at some point by his will. And so that points to a personal creator. But what of all that? Well, it turns out I think, this is just the attributes of God. In fact, you come to these attributes without even opening up the good book, without even opening the Bible. You come to some of the same attributes that God's word explains to us. His eternality and his power and so on. And so it seems like this is powerful argument for the existence of a supreme being. Now, there's a common objection to this material I just gave you. And it's a central argument to Richard Dawkins' book. He basically said, you want to say that God made the universe? Well, who made God, Christian? If you want to say that God designed the universe, well, who designed the designer? You can't say that God is the cause unless you tell me who made God. Now, here's the problem with this question. It's actually a really foolish question for Richard Dawkins to ask. I think he's a smart guy. But this is just foolishness. In fact, you could ask him this. In fact, I've asked my daughter, she's 4, and said, Juliana, what does the color blue smell like? And my daughter will say blueberry, because she's not super bright. No, she says blueberry, but she doesn't know that colors, no, they don't have a smell. Blueberries have a smell, but not the color blue. This is an illogical question to ask. It's a category error. What does the color blue smell like? The assumption is that blue has a smell. That's a false assumption. Similarly, to ask the question, who made God? What does that assume? It assumes that God was made. But nobody thinks God was made. You read the Bible, it says that God is eternal. From everlasting to everlasting, you are God. The atheist doesn't even believe in God, so he obviously doesn't believe that God was made. So who in this discussion believes that God was made? It's like asking this question. Who is the bachelor married to? Not the TV show. Like, who is the bachelor? The guy who's single? That's what a bachelor is. Who's he married to? What's his wife's name? That's an illogical question. It's incoherent. Why? Because bachelors by definition are unmarried, right? To ask who made God is like asking who designed the undesigned designer. It doesn't make any sense. God wasn't designed, he wasn't made. And so Richard Dawkins should have called his book The Created God Delusion. Because I do think created gods are a delusion. In fact, we call those idols. That's what the Bible calls them, those created gods. But we don't believe in that God. We believe in the eternal, God. And Psalm says this, before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Okay? Now, I don't think Richard Dawkins is being fair, because if you found, let's say you're an archaeologist, and you found those arrowheads, okay? Now, you can all see that they're arrowheads, right, and not something else. They look designed, don't they? Especially if you were an archaeologist, you would recognize that. Now, Richard Dawkins would have to ask this question. Oh, wait, you want to say that someone carved those? Well, who designed the designer of those? That is, who made those? You can't tell me that those are designed unless you know who was responsible for that. Well, here's the problem. What if we never knew who was responsible? We just found the arrowheads. We have no idea what civilization is responsible for that. Let's make the problem even worse. Imagine we went to the dark side of the moon. There's a part of the moon that, because of the way it rotates and it orbits, it's always dark to us. Imagine we went there and found machinery like this. That's not real. That's from Transformers. Imagine you found that machinery. What Dawkins would have to say is, whoa. You want to say that's designed, that machinery? Nuh-uh. You got to first tell me who designed the designer of that machinery. Tell me who that is first. You don't need to know who made that. Maybe aliens, maybe whatever. We don't know. You could still look at that machinery and say, that's designed. That's designed. You don't need to know who designed the designer, okay? And so we do this all the time. In fact, there's a SETI program. There's a program called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, SETI, that they poured millions of dollars into. They point radio telescopes into the sky, and they're just searching for a signal that comes back that has some intelligence to it. If you watch the movie Contact that came out years ago, they found a signal that came back. It was all the prime numbers. This is intelligence. Dawkins, no. You can't say that's intelligent, even though it's all the prime numbers, because you don't know who designed the designer. You see the way this argument goes? It refutes numerous disciplines like archaeology, like the SETI program, and others.